join me in welcoming my partner and friend, Drew Erdmann.
I was actually trained as a historian. I have a history PhD from Harvard, where I focused on the critical question of how Americans think about ending wars. You know, how do you use military force to achieve political objectives? That's how I spent the 1990s. I was a scholar. I was doing my PhD. I thought I was going to do academia. Then I decided I didn't want to do academia. I had an opportunity to, at that point in time, enter U.S. government service on Colin Powell's staff, on the policy planning staff. I was a non-political appointee, which is part of the story. I'm nonpartisan, but I was an expert hire, and because of my history dissertation, that meant that I got involved in the pre-war planning for Iraq. And did a major project in 2002 thinking about the potential post-conflict situation in Iraq. We can talk about that if you want to in greater depth. Then what that led to, much to my wife's chagrin and most of the people who knew me, is I was asked to be one of the first civilian administrators to go into Iraq, and I was detailed to the Department of Defense in February of 2003 to go in. And I did. You know, I was a civilian administrator then. I actually, at one point in time, had a ministry of 45,000 employees and trying to get it back and running in 2003. So that image of the hapless people who didn't have any clue or didn't have any training, I was, you know, that guy. So we can talk about that. And then I had the option. I was asked if I would leave Iraq to go to the White House on the National Security Council staff. And my wife was eager to have me back home, so I did that. Back home in the United States, my wife and I actually lived apart all this time. She's a professor in Washington University in St. Louis, and I was living in Washington, in the Middle East. But just set stage down, I was at the White House, and I was director for Iran and Iraq strategic planning. As I often quip, because we didn't have an Iran policy from 2003 to 2005, I didn't have a lot of work to do, so I did mostly Iraq work. But that took me back to Iraq again in a very different capacity, which was working on the negotiations with the Iraqis on the transition from the Coalition Provisional Authority to the first government. So whether it's Ahmed Chalabi or Iyad Alawi or the whole gang of merry pranksters, you know, worked with them in different ways. Left that, came to McKinsey to do private sector work, and then got drawn back into, can't talk in detail about client work that we do at McKinsey, but then in 2006 got drawn back into some very special work we were doing on the ground in Iraq, mostly related to economic development. And so from that standpoint, I've worked with US government as well as international financial institutions in Iraq now for 5 or 6 years. And in between that, I did an extended period of time, also 18 months of working in Afghanistan. And so while I was in Iraq, I've been all over Iraq. Unlike the caricature of the early days of Iraq where everyone was in the green zone or whatever, I was in Basra, I was in Kirkuk, I was in Mosul, I was out every day. And in Afghanistan, I've been all over Afghanistan, except actually where it's exceptionally dangerous. I've been in eastern Afghanistan, Nangarhar province, which is somewhat sketchy, but didn't do time in Kandahar or Helmand province, but the rest of Afghanistan I've been around. So the reason why I give that as a preface is that basically now I've had 10 years of experience. I've served in the White House. I've had my own team, a joint military international team on the ground in Iraq, where I work with Czechs and Italians and Americans, and whether it's been working with Italians in Western Afghanistan, but it's all informed by a certain historical perspective as well. So it's a very personal one. It's also one that I'll say I try and come at things in a non-ideological way. I'll start by saying up front, I think that it's not a happy talk if you want to talk about the last decade. I think every institution of the US government systematically failed, and I think that both political parties have systematically failed. So that's what I think is, so I think that's my kind of starting point. And I could review at each point in the story where, so I come at it more of, you know, we've all sinned, and I think there's a lot to learn and reflect upon. It's been a particularly challenging decade. As a former historian of American history, I can claim it's like, you know, I'm not a doctor who can do anything useful, but I can say something about history. It's like, this has been like one of the worst decades in American foreign policy. This is just, and it's one of those perplexing things where it causes us, I think, to reflect, what can we do in the world? You know, what are the limits of what we can do? Are there structural reasons that we have had such a rough decade? I think it's a little facile to attribute it to one person or one political party or anything like that. I think there are deeper forces at work. But those are some of the things that I'm happy to talk about. But I did want to set the stage of, I come at it from a perspective of, I've seen it from multiple vantage points. I have not seen it, you know, I've worked extensively with the military in both Afghanistan and Iraq. But those who are veterans, I know there's some in the room. I mean, I didn't have the experience of being, you know, being a platoon leader in Helmand or something like that. So that also shades it that I come at it from a perspective of a civilian who spent a lot of time working with military organizations as well as civilian organizations, U.S. and international. And I would argue it's not just the U.S. institutions that haven't done a particularly good job. I think it's equal opportunity.
Do your whole PhD dissertation,
Yeah.
but what did you learn?
A personal reflection on what I personally learned in the last decade or 12 years. And I should say, it even started before then. When I was on the Secretary of Staff, I actually did counterterrorism policy. And so at 9/11 onwards, I was involved in the engagement in Afghanistan from the very first week of that period of time. So I am definitely, my professional lens has been critically shaped by those events of 9/11 and the aftermath, for better and for worse. One thing I take away from it is, and this is maybe inside the Beltway thing, I came at it, look, I had a Harvard history PhD, I was surrounded by a lot of smart people. There's a bias of a lot of smart people on the outside of government to think it's a policy ideas. You know, if only they knew what the right policy was, right? If only, you know, they did, and that's really about 20% of the equation. It's really a huge amount about execution. Most of what goes on in foreign policy, national security policy is like, can you actually manage the process well? And I say that from a reflection, and I want to give just one example to illustrate it, and then one other thing. That really struck home for me, which was in November of 2004, right after the election for President Bush's second term. I was at the NSC, and it was the third time the NSC had meetings on Mosul strategy. Now, the reason Mosul, city in northern Iraq, kind of a center, one of the last very difficult urban environments, although the urban environments, and I have a team in Iraq right now, I should say, remain challenging, but really a tough area of the insurgency. The reason why I know it was the third time, basically, the National Security Council had exactly the same discussion with exactly the same position papers, and they agreed to do exactly the same thing to do. And it's all the people in Washington saying, yeah, you know, we ought to have a strategy, and we ought to do these 5 things, and the military ought to do this, and the civilians ought to do this. And then it's like, but wait a second, I've seen this movie 3 times already. And so that's one part of the story, that there's a huge amount on the execution side that is, again, apolitical. I would just note that if someone doesn't know how to manage the process, challenging things happen. And there's a bias on the outside that's like, if only they knew, if they had the right policy prescription, you know, good things would follow. Second thing, and this is a general critique, and I think it cuts across, you know, it's a pattern that I especially saw in Afghanistan, but I think it holds true in Iraq, which is the broader lesson, which is it's all about them, but we make it all about us. What I mean by that is that the predominant forces shaping a lot of what we did in both of these countries are actually about us. What I mean by that is the politics, the domestic politics, party politics, bureaucratic politics, scoring points in Washington, D.C., etc., in different forms. and it can be, and it spans both political parties, and we can talk about that. But as opposed to being really centered on, let's assume for a sake of discussion that we should be trying to help stabilize the country of Afghanistan. What's the right mindset? And the right mindset is more of like, what's going on in Afghanistan? What's the dynamics in that country? What's the incredibly complicated history and governance, not necessarily governance structures that emerge through, gazillions of eons. And instead of imposing kind of our solutions, and it sounds like a cliche thing, but oftentimes it is the best, brightest ideas, and I saw it from the most well-meaning people across the different political spectrums and across US and international organizations. They come with their solutions that are their solutions of de jour, and they try and impose them. And so it's about us, not about them. And I think that's a big lesson that I took away. And then the corollary of that is that because I am a realist about international politics, that these tragedies, we will be engaged in these kinds of things whether we like it or not in the future. Whether on the scale of this, we can debate. But we need to learn the right lessons from this, and you need to be very humble. And in dealing with these situations, is for the most part an organic process defined by local forces, and we as Americans have a really difficult time with that. We try and impose things on our timeline, and it comes back to being about us.
Yeah, I know this is an impossible thing to answer in a short response, but what happened? And
I don't necessarily have a privileged position on. I understand pretty well the very early days of Afghanistan. Again, I will emphasize like a particular bureaucratic standpoint of being on the Secretary of Staff, Secretary of Powell's staff. My boss then, Richard Haas, was the coordinator for Afghanistan policy. Richard was the person who brought me into government, so we had a particular vantage point, and there are a few things to remember about that period of time, which is that the tensions between the approach of the Department of Defense and the Department of State were incredibly stark in that period of time. And when I say that, it doesn't mean one's right or the other. I have my own perspective, but I say with humility, there was some real tensions. Real tensions. But I think that, we all know the story. I do think that there's a broad brush, which is, for many people in the administration, the real problem was Iraq. I mean, that's the way they did for whatever or rather the solution was Iraq, whatever, and then there are different definitions of the problem. So there was, I can say, from personal experience, within 72 hours of 9/11, the planning was, certain people, I should say, were already saying this is the opportunity to go after Iraq. That's in the public domain, and that's, that's been recounted before, but and again, we can talk about whether that's wise or unwise, but analytically speaking, there were people who thought that Iraq was the real challenge that needed to be solved. So I think as a very simple proposition, Afghanistan in the early days was never really the focal point. There was no great desire to be involved in nation building in Afghanistan. And after 10 years and after having spent some time there, that's not exactly the craziest proposition in the world to say we don't necessarily want to be involved in nation building there. So let's, just as a reminder, the people in the Department of Defense, I'm being caricature, there are multiple, but who are saying like, we probably don't want to be involved in a heavy footprint, nation building. It's not the craziest proposition in the world. That said, what it clearly did, I know that, and again, there's some folks in the audience from the special operations community. What it meant in very practical terms is that in that period of time, the high demand, low density assets, as the expression goes, intelligence and special operations assets were shifted pretty early out of Afghanistan to focus on Iraq. And those are exactly the kind of assets you need for that kind of operation. So there really wasn't a big commitment to Afghanistan, I think, for a whole host of reasons. partly too hard. We don't want to get involved. You know, remember the Russians. Remember, I mean, this is like, remember the British. Remember, it's like the frickin' Hindu Kush. I mean, if you've ever been, I mean, seriously, it's like, it's crazy terrain. It's a crazy difficult environment. There are a whole host of reasons not to get involved. But then there is a draw to Iraq. So I think that that's one of the reasons why Afghanistan was never taken as a really high priority. And I say this then when I was at the White House, I didn't work with Afghanistan policy, but our team was the Afghan team as well. So I worked, so shoulder, you know, in the same office. And so I knew, I can assure you, like the relative priority and how much attention they got, the rhythm, the battle rhythm, so to speak, of senior level attention in, you know, 03, 04, 05 on Afghanistan was just low. And the indications were that things were relatively under control, so to speak, and it slipped away. I mean, the Taliban was in retreat. It was, you know, problem solved, and we moved on to other things. So I think that then, you know, that's the story. There's a rhythm to that, and then, you know, once the different, and I should say Taliban, the different elements of that, and this is getting way into, you know, you lift it up, there's the different elements of the Afghan insurgency. You know, some of them could have been dealt with at different points in time, but they weren't. And we live with that today. Or I should say the Afghan people live with that today.
10 years later, you've been back to Afghanistan. What's it like now, and is there any graceful path out of this?
I haven't been to Afghanistan for about a year on the ground. So, you know, I caveat everything with that. So, you know, many people in this room will be as informed as I am about Afghanistan. From reading the newspapers, I catch up with my friends, and I have people who are my friends who are serving there. You know, when you say an exit, I guess, you know, we'll exit, and the Afghan people will continue to live with the consequences. I mean, it's not that they're all victims. I mean, there are actors in this as well. I mean, I would imagine that the answer to the question, which has already been decided upon, is that there'll be some kind of negotiated solution with the Taliban. The shift is taken in our policy that there's, you know, the negotiations are ongoing. There will be some solution where some of the Taliban will be part of it. That's normally the way things happen in civil wars, whether it's in Latin America or elsewhere. That there'll be a political solution. If not, this will be the gift that keeps on giving. And I say that and it won't be for us, it'll be for the Afghan people and others. There's great complexities, obviously, because of the role of Pakistan. And I think what has bedeviled us as the United States is that actually we don't have a coherent, we don't have a coherent strategy for Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is really about the whole alignment of South Asia. And the reason why the Pakistanis are meddling in Afghanistan is because it's all about India. You know, I mean, if you're there, you know, so I mean, if you don't have a coherent strategy for the region, it doesn't make sense, and you're never going to solve the problem, right? And I'm not even talking about my old friends, the Iranians, who I once was a professional preoccupation of mine. If you don't have a coherent strategy, and quite frankly, if the others kind of do, you're always going to be at a disadvantage. And the Pacs, I think, have an approach. The Pakistanis, the Iranians, and others they understand what their stakes are. And I will say that we've harmed ourselves, and this is where I'll say something that will be critical of this administration, which is I think that when President Obama announced the surge of American forces into Afghanistan in December 2002, after the extended debate, the second debate, an Afghan review of the same year by the same administration, when they put in place the deadline for the American withdrawal, I think it fundamentally undercut the surge, and it signaled to all parties in the region that the United States was not serious about staying. And then that meant that the Taliban knew they could wait us out. It meant the Pakistanis would wait us out. And it also was a signal to the Afghans that we weren't going to be there. Now, whether that's right, wrong, or otherwise, that triggered a whole series of, I think, horrendous dynamics that once the bell was rung, it wasn't going to be unrung, and it meant that every single actor involved in Afghanistan was hedging on the American withdrawal. And that fundamentally undercut everything we were doing. And so my own personal point of view was that either we should have gone, or we should have gone in or gone out. But we threaded a needle that and again, this is where I'll note, I think for domestic political reasons, domestic political politics, we threaded a course that increased our expenditure in blood and financial resources with, in the end, probably not a lot of gain.
Okay, from that pleasant topic, let's talk about an easier one in Iraq.
Lenny's like a good lawyer, which is you never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. So it's like, was it really well thought out? Yeah, Lenny, it was great. You know, according to plan. No, I mean, look. Again, I have a certain vantage point from having been at that point in time on the State Department before I was detailed over to the Department of Defense to go in with the military in 03. One of the things that's just peculiar, and I'll say this as a historian, you know, that I do believe when all the records are revealed, and there's been a lot of memoirs and stuff is already unpacked, but if you compare the Johnson administration's decision to escalate in 1965 to the U.S. government's, and I want to say U.S. government because Congress was involved in this escalation, in the kind of 02 time period, the Johnson administration looks much better. And I say that seriously because if you go into the archives or go into the history, there was like a real serious, extended, very realistic policy debate. There were real options on the table. It was a very structured discussion about we're in a tough situation, South Vietnam's going to fall, but what do we do? Here's escalatory options. They all look bad. But it was a structured policy debate. That didn't exist, I think it's fair to say, in the Iraq case, for a whole host of reasons, many of which I don't fully understand to this day. But it was, I think it's been publicly recounted. It was my boss recounted, Richard Haas. It was one of those things of he went to the NSC in 2002, and this is how I got involved in Iraq. And had the conversation with Condi Rice. I think it's recounted in his book, which you have there, where he basically said, "Hey, if we go to war with Iraq, you know, what's the, you know, let's gin up the planning, but you know, the kind of policy debate, you know, structured." And it's kind of like, what do you mean if? It's like we're going to war. And so that's a kind of sense of if the secretary's strategy person didn't know the decision had been made to go to war, that kind of shows that there wasn't a structured process to come to that conclusion. Doesn't mean the conclusion would have been the same conclusion, but I'm just making a kind of process point. So it wasn't the most robust, well thought through. I think the other thing though is that there's a prevailing assumptions that we'd be in and out relatively rapidly. And that was a working assumption. It was with the military, it was with the civilians, that there'd be a significant drawdown by the end of 2003. I mean, that was the military planning. I can assure you when I was surprised when I was at the Pentagon getting ready to go to Iraq. And again, this was originally with the Office of Reconstruction Humanitarian Assistance. That will be a Trivial Pursuit question one day. That was the predecessor to the Coalition Provisional Authority. We were supposed to go in to help administer the transition and civilian governance of Iraq, and I remember having a conversation with the chief logistician, and he was complaining about the civilians were asking for more and more and more, and he's like, you know, I'll tell you, I'm telling everyone we've only got slots for 150 people, but I've actually really planned for 180. And I was like, that's for the governance of Iraq, a country of 30 million people? And that was an entire plan, including the military support, so it was actually the equivalent of about 40 civilians that they were planning for. So that, you know, it was mostly military. So it was meant to be a temporary transition. Now we can get into why they assumed there could be a temporary transition. But nonetheless, I mean, that was a kind of operational planning.
You mentioned this book, and it was, looking back at this again, it's a terrific book. If anybody hasn't seen this, Richard Haas's book, War of Necessity, War of Choice. He was in both Iraq wars, and it's his depiction of what we chose to do. And in the back of this is a memo that was penned under Richard Haas's name, but I know who the author was. He happens to be sitting next to me. That talked about, as you're thinking about the lessons from the past in Iraq, what could you learn, and what does that mean for what we should be doing, assuming we went into Iraq?
Yeah.
You want to tell us what that was about?
Yeah, this is the project when Richard came back from the NSC, and I can remember he called me into the office and said, "Drew, I got a special project for you," because it's like, because of my history PhD, I always joke I had the only relevant history PhD of the 1990s. I was asked, "Hey, could you do a special project on what are the lessons of the past for post-conflict stabilization?" And he goes, there are two things that I never thought I'd hear from Richard Haas's mouth. The length doesn't matter, which is in government the idea of a memo where someone says the length doesn't matter, make it as long as, it was 15 pages single-spaced, which is like, you know, War and Peace by government standards. It's like, take as much, you know, this is serious stuff. And then punchline though, I mean, of all this, it's no surprise, which is you get what you pay for. You get what you pay for. If you're gonna, these post-conflict stabilization, now what do I mean by that? This comes from a historical standpoint where I approach things, and it certainly is the case. I think this basic conclusion has been reinforced by last decade, which is the most important aspect is really to achieve your objectives. It relates to the post-conflict phase of whatever conflict you're talking about. The military phase, although brutal, the quote-unquote military phase of the application, military force in a traditional sense, is actually something we do quite well. We're very good at regime destruction, not necessarily regime change. That's something that you can do very well with just the application of force, but it requires a much more calibrated, sophisticated investment to stabilize the situation. You know, and we're living with that consequence today. So, you get what you pay for. If you don't invest, if you don't take it very seriously, bad things happen. Simple as that. That was a lesson. That was what the memo was about. That was what we were talking about in the Department of, where I was, in the Department of State. I should say I was a Iraq War skeptic. I wasn't convinced, not from a WMD standpoint, but I wasn't convinced it was strategically the right move, because I was looking at this is a huge roll of the dice, because you're talking about a nation of 30 million people, and how are you going to stabilize that thing? And no doubt that we could deal with the Iraqi military. I don't think anyone had any doubt about that. But it was like, this is a huge roll of the dice. And the question to me was, are we serious enough to really plan and invest and put resources? And as it became clear that we weren't, that's where my alarm bells were going way off, way early. I don't understand Iran very well. I only worked on it for a little while. A couple observations about Iran. One is that what we're seeing play out is just a long time story. I mean, we're seeing the long-term story of a consolidation of the kind of really hardcore elements of the Iranian regime. It goes back to, the indicators are there in 2003, 2004. I won't bore you with some of these things like the modulus elections of early 2000, we don't need to go through that. But I think that the topic of choice is about the Iranian nuclear program. I think that the Iranians are, from their standpoint, very rational in the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. I don't think they're going to give it up. I just note that the Shah had a program. It goes back to the 1970s. The Iranians had, the Islamic regime had a covert program for 18 or 19 years. Everyone knows it's a covert program. The IAEA, all this. What's interesting about the Iran story is that, from a strategic kind of analytic situation, is that you could make the argument that Iran was the real threat in the region. I think Iraq was as well, quite frankly. I mean, you can't discount the threat of Saddam Hussein and that history of that regime. But the Iranian regime was also a big threat, I would argue, for regional stability. And yet what we did is we went from the Great Satan to the Great Santa Claus. What I mean by that is we eliminated we eliminated Saddam Hussein's regime and we eliminated the Taliban, which were, again, they almost went to war with the Taliban, the Iranian regime. So we actually radically altered and made favorable for a period of time their strategic environment. They greatly extended their influence into Iraq, which is undeniable. That's something I did have to work on, and that is something that continues to bedevil us to this day. They're under real strain. They are under real strain because of, I think, the sanctions regime. But at the end of the day, I don't see why they would reach a conclusion they'd want to give up a nuclear weapons program, because the lesson that they undoubtedly draw is that every regime that, the North Koreans are still in power because they have nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein would have been in power if he had an effective nuclear program. And the international community, regrettably, I will say this, we would have the conversations with my European counterparts back in 03, 04. It's not a surprise how this story was going to play out, which is that the people were not going to, the Europeans would hem and haw, and they would be like, well, maybe they aren't really pursuing a weapons program, only weapons capable, and it goes on, and it just plays out for years, and then I think we're going to wake up one day, and then we'll deal with the cascade of the Saudi program and the Egyptian program, assuming, of course, that the Israelis don't do something first, or if the, and that's why we're doing cyber and all these other things. But no one has an appetite for the thousands of sorties thousands of sorties would have to be flown by the U.S. airplanes to suppress the air defense and bring down that nuclear program. So no one has an appetite for that.
A lot of people said that we went into Iraq was because of oil. How has it ended up?
So I actually don't buy we went to war for oil region. What I do buy, though, is one of the big arguments is that we cared about regional stability because of oil. I mean, that's a different argument. It's not like control of Iraqi oil, but it's instability in the region. But in terms of the Iraqi oil, the projections, and again, I'm distant from a lot of this stuff, so let me take, please take all the caveats. But first of all, the Iraqi government has a lot of money, because they're making a lot of money, and in the next decade or so, if they hit their production targets with all the caveats along that, and they can get the pipelines and get it out, all the caveats around that, which relate to political risk. The projections are 80% of OPIC's growth in the next decade of production will be out of Iraq. 80% of all of OPIC's expanded production will be coming out of Iraq.
Chris?
So, the past is the past, but what do you see as being sort of the best that could be achieved?
The first thing is, I actually don't think we got a lot of leverage. I'm going to start with that. It's like, let's be humble in terms of what we can do. The dynamics across the region are mostly indigenous. We have very little leverage. We see that in a country like Egypt, where we talk about, we're going to put together an enterprise fund, and I think the enterprise fund, to stimulate economic development is like $50 or $60 million, and like 20 million in Tunisia. It's like, it's not even serious. It's like, this is, to the scale of the problem, it's not serious. So, but I think the broader thing across the region is the region is going to be probably looking at 10 years of volatility. The region. A country like Egypt, which you can read in the headlines, I have no idea. I don't think anyone does. And as I would say about what I learned with Iraq, and my instinct with Iraq, was whenever I spoke with anyone who was confident of their judgment in 2002, I didn't trust them. And it was either way. If someone was confident, like, no, we can contain Iraq, it's so easy, it's like, I don't know about this, and oh no, it's easy to do. So I think that we're going to, from a U.S. standpoint, I think it's a matter of getting comfortable with the situation where there'll be extreme volatility for a decade.
So what do you think the consequences of that are? I mean, just playing out the chess game kind of thing.
It could
Force
be.
them to drink more.
Yeah, no, I need to drink. I'm gonna. By the end of the, can I have another beer? Yeah, please. No, I can see really. Let's just remember, and it's easy to step back and now be like, oh, Afghanistan, Iraq, all the 1% doctrine, all that. The fact is, and again, the fact is that a country called Yemen is like a threat to the United States right now. I mean, that's just, we do live in a world where that's actually true. And what very well, on one end of the spectrum, what we may end up having is a decade of policy by predator, and we may have, basically a very intense counterterrorism, direct action approach to addressing legitimate direct threats to American citizens. That is a reality out there. That some people in the U.S. government live with every day, like that bad world where there are really bad people who are trying to kill us. Maybe that's what we can get through a decade where there's enough policy by predator. That's one end of the spectrum. Maybe the image of Islamist parties coming in and maturing and moderating and learning how to effectively manage the institutions of state, maybe that happens. But at another end of the spectrum, you see the fragmentation of Syria, with each week becoming an incredibly polarized situation, and you could see that being like, all bets are off, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, like reconfiguring the borders of that region. Or you look at a situation like Saudi, which if the numbers in Saudi where that's going are deeply troubling, and objectively we're looking at a whole series of really tough trends, and many of them we don't have leverage on, and we don't even understand yet. And I just want to use one factor, which is the Saudis to stabilize the regime and to stabilize the region are taking tens of billions of dollars and pumping it into job programs, hiring 50 or 60,000 people to the Ministry of Interior, public, affordable housing, pumping money into Oman, doing operations in Yemen. Well, okay, they're pumping tens of billions of dollars a year. What that's meant for Saudi Arabia is that for them to have a balanced budget, it used to be around $60 a barrel, because everything basically comes back to oil. It's now around $100 a barrel. And it's soon going to be around 115. So, number one, that means that the Saudis, the historical stabilizers of international energy markets, no longer have quite the same incentive. But the other thing is, if energy prices are below that, that means that they're in the red, and they've always been in the black. Which means they're only going to be able to buy their way out of the trouble, and they know that. I mean, the very smart people can look at these trend lines and be like, this is your guess is as good as mine where that ends up.
What was most frustrating to you at that time?
Well, we can come back to actually some things that we did very well. And I can put that to the side, which is people think everything's been done very badly. There's actually some huge success stories in this period of time. And there's some lessons to be drawn from those. I think that it's a great question. There's a recurring debate among my colleagues, and I'm sure it's similar to the ones you have, which is how much of it was structurally like this is just a bad thing that we couldn't fix, Humpty Dumpty's knocked over. How much of it was tied to either lack of policy design or actually execution. The execution was utterly horrendous and incoherent. So that would be, for a period of time, I was more focused on that side of the equation. I think that it causes me to reflect a lot, because I remember in October 2003, I had a conversation with someone in the audience. I remember Kala Sepp was in the Washington, D.C. is at NSC, and that was when I came to the conclusion in October 2003, I'd been at the NSC about 6 weeks. I said, we're going to lose, being in terms of our definition of our objectives. And the challenge is there are different levels of losing. And we face a very dangerous situation of, if we continue to pursue maximalist goals, we'll end up losing more than if we were realistic and started to scale back. But I think that we, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's the term, the golden moment or something like that, where you do have a situation where you can assert more control because of the collapse of the regime and because of the maximum impact, both perceived and real, of our power. And I would argue that in both of those, we didn't really exercise that in a coherent manner. So I think that is one huge lost opportunity. I don't think I'm going to answer your question adequately, because what I've continued to see, and this, I'll give a structural answer, Tommy, to some of it, which is a lot of the policy incoherence that we've experienced over the last 10 years is the fact that our rotations are between 9 and 14 months on the military and civilian side. So there are very few people who actually serve, and there's very little continuity, which you know well. And so the practical implications of that are that we constantly are reinventing the wheel. And we've done it in Afghanistan, we've done it in Iraq, and so it's meant that there's been really huge incoherence, I would argue.
The balance between a strategy of democratization, the existence of a tribal culture, and a religious culture.
Yeah, it's a great, this is where I think it comes back to where I started off by saying, it comes back to, is it about them or is it about us? If you look at, I'll say a few things about Iraq, and there may be some missed opportunities there, but it's certainly in Afghanistan. The international community helps support the bond process that created the new governance system and constitution of Afghanistan. Okay. If you read the Constitution of Afghanistan, it is one of the most centralized governments on the face of the earth. It is one of the president has the power to appoint and hire and fire all governors. He gets down into the mayors of major cities. It is incredibly centralized power. Kind of comparative politics sense. Now, if you go to Afghanistan, you probably would say, that's probably not their tradition. Okay? I'm just going to go, and just fly over the country, let alone walk around, you might say, it probably doesn't work that way here. It probably never worked that way here. And so I think that that's an example of, there's a political scientist, James Barfield, he's at Princeton, I guess, who's talked about the distinction between government and governance. There's a lot of traditional governance mechanisms in Afghanistan that we kind of brushed aside, that were tribal but others, in light of, like our model of we're going to have a centralized government, we're going to have a strong centralized army, we're going to do all this other stuff. And I think that that's an example of where international community may have made a mistake, and there might have been a more, and some people feel that once we leave, we'll stabilize because they will be able to work out their own equilibrium. Again, I wouldn't laugh. There's long periods of Afghan history where it's the case where they did. So, on the Iraqi side, I think what was one of the interesting things was, and this is really getting inside the memory banks, that you have to remember that Iraq, and I really believe this, was not people have multiple identities in any society. I live in St. Louis, I work for a certain company, I once was in government, I have a certain college identity, whatever, maybe religious, maybe not. in Iraq, the sectarian identity was not their primary identity for most people. Okay? Now, I'm not going to talk about the Kurds, that's an exception. The Kurd Arab thing is like, that's a, but there is heavy intermarriage in many communities. There is, and when you actually went and what little public opinion polling was done in 03, 04, there was extraordinarily little confidence or desire in the established political parties that we were working with, okay? The established political parties with their militias, the Sadrists at one point in time, but then the Badr Corps, the guys who had been out in Iran, there's actually very low political support for those, and actually distrust of parties. But there was trust in other institutions of government, like judges, professors, technocrats, because there's a tradition of education and a variety of other things around. And we decided, because the parties were easier to work with. And if you looked at so that's one thing, we made a choice. The other thing, though, that I would argue is that, akin to some of the dynamics, I think, in the Balkans, which is, it's not like in 1985 people were remembering, battles against the Ottomans 400 years before that shaped their identity. But once you live in a community where they come, no matter how secular you are, and they put a red mark on your door and they say, we will come and kill you and your family unless you move. That has a tendency to make your identity a little more acute. And so I say that in all seriousness, that very secular Sunnis, for example, secular Sunnis were like, we will work with Al-Qaeda. We will work with Al-Qaeda because they will fight. They will keep, what am I going to do? They're going to come and, oh, by the way, remember the days, it was a civil war. Once you open up that spigot of ethnic cleansing, which is basically what happened in Iraq, it's hard to unring that bell. There are hundreds of people every day ending up on the streets of Baghdad totally mutilated in the most horrific manner. What would you do if your son had a Black & Decker drill put to his head and drilled through his head until he was dead? How would you feel about that? This is one of the things of it's about them. They're human beings. How would you interpret that? If you lived in that environment, remember New Orleans. This is the thing that one of the lessons I take away from this is that all societies are incredibly fragile. All societies and social dimension. Because it doesn't take much to tip it. And once you tip it, once you come to a community, which happened, when the Shia came out and said, leave us alone, to the like Sadrists, just leave us alone. We're here with our Sunni, just leave us alone. Don't come to kick out the Sunni, just leave us alone. And they go, shoot the person right in the street and say, next. That's what happened in Diyala province. Once you unleash that, there's no one ringing that bell. And I think that's where Iraq is today. And I think in certain respects, unfortunately, the question of Afghanistan governance, where I don't know enough about the country, I don't pretend to, but I will make the observation that you're dealing with a country that for over 30 years has had a systematic targeting of all of its basic nodes of governance and kinship networks and tribal networks. First by the communists, Afghan communists, then by the Soviets, then by the Taliban, and the warlords. Then, imagine what would happen to a society if you had deliberate targeting of all respected, either you co-opt the people or you kill the people. And you do that for 3 or 4 decades.
Do you see someone who's going to change? What are the hopeful signs?
It's a great what I will say is, look, I don't have an answer to that, and I think this goes back to this dilemma. It's about whether America, what's our domestic, I think it relates as much to domestic politics and a whole host of other things, of whether we're going to square some of this stuff away. Despite everything I've said, and this sounds I'm actually I will, while being analytic, I'll say I actually kind of believe in a certain form of American exceptionalism, and I can, personal belief, but probably not what is normally out there. But despite the kind of depressing array of things that I've said, and we've talked about, because we did focus on, I would argue, 2 failures. I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, these are 2 incredibly costly failures. I'm not going to answer the question about what's the defense budget, how are we going to sort out American domestic politics so it isn't such a polarizing thing. I'm actually discouraged by a lot of those dynamics, because I think, here's one observation about my greatest concern. And then I'll say something that's a little encouraging, to end on a high note. What I find very disturbing about this point in time is that, and I go back to some of the first comments, every institution in the US government systematically failed. I believe the US Congress did not fulfill its responsibilities. I believe, we can run through the list of things. I think the intelligence community failed in some things. I think Department of Defense, I think the uniformed military, the reason why that matters is that every single person who has a slice of this can point to someone else and say, they're the ones who effed this thing up. And I can assure you that from the way I saw the quality at times of some of our diplomatic presence, and I say this as a former State Department person, I'm appalled. Some of it's absolutely sterling, but you can come out of it and be like, this is ridiculous. Same on the military side. Why does that matter? What I'm concerned about is that when it comes time to reflection, it's not the kind of thing of I screwed up. It's the other guy screwed up. And if my outlook is the other guy screwed up, that means I'm not going to be very introspective. I'm not going to change the way I view the world. And I think that almost everyone associated with this, and every institution, can point to someone else fairly, because everyone messed up. And so I have a very low confidence that there's going to be a lot of systemic learning. So that's a big concern, which, history repeats itself kind of perspective. The positive note, though, I do want to end on a positive note, is that, no, and I say this seriously, it's how many of you remember the summer of, what was one of the big foreign policy issues of the summer of 2001? Colombia. Plan Colombia. The United States is going to be involved in another Vietnam and Latin America. There's a major foreign policy issue, the largest foreign assistance package outside the Middle East. How are we going to stabilize Colombia? How can you take on an insurgency down there? How can this happen? Well, things are different today. In large part because actually we were actively involved in Colombia. And I know people in the room know more about it than I do. I spent some time down there. It's actually a huge success story. It doesn't mean it's out of the woods, not at all. But there's some lessons there, which is, one of the lessons is that we weren't in the lead. It was that he was actually a local, he was supporting someone doing something. And it's not to say that everything's wonderful down there at all, but if you go back to what was said in the summer of 2001 about the debate of the future of Colombia, and compare where it is today, there were not many people who would have taken that bet. So there is ability for the United States, I would argue, to play a constructive role. It can be successful, but it's usually when you're actually helping someone who has the will and skill and is willing to take the risks, and they have the skill. And I should say, from having met some of the Colombians, they're very good. They're very skilled, they're very intelligent, they're very impressive. That, that's an example of, I would argue, the United States net probably made a pretty good investment. And it was a tough, thorny problem that it will endure, but are things better than they were 10 years ago? Probably. So that's what I'm concerned about, going back to the broader learning, which is that many people will feel like, it's all too hard to handle. We can't, the world is too messy, it's too hard. And as I said, I think that's a very unpleasant world for everybody, not just from the standpoint of American interest, but I genuinely believe from the standpoint of a lot of people around the world who don't want instability in their life, because the instability is a term that's very analytic. It sounds very antiseptic, but as the kind of graphic examples I used from Iraq, instability is very immediate and devastating to many families around the world.
So I want to try and conclude this evening by reflecting for a moment, which is, you can see why I like having drinks with Drew. It's a good chance to actually get a personal and real reflection of what's going on. And I know this is a very serious topic, and I don't want to make light of it, but I do want to ask you to join me in thanking Drew for spending his 4th of July with us to have a really complicated conversation over a couple of years. So thank you, Drew.